Welcome again to this conference, SciDeepNet 2021, the final conference of the S4D4C project. It's super exciting to have you here again. We hope that you had already enjoyed some parallel sessions in the morning with our collaboration partners. For today's welcome in the plenary, I'm actually quasi joined by the German Minister Anja Karliczek. She is setting the scene, and my colleagues are going to share the video now.
Sehr geehrte Damen und Herren, Corona, Klima...
Oops. She got kicked out, but I'm sure that Laurent is going to fix that soon. Yes, there it comes.
Biodiversität. Die Herausforderung, Wandel, Biodiversität. Sehr geehrte Damen und Herren, Corona, Biodiversität. Die Herausforderungen und sehr geehrte Damen und Herren, Corona, Klimawandel, Biodiversität. Die Herausforderungen unserer Zeit sind internationale Herausforderungen und wir können sie nur gemeinsam machen.
Okay, she's getting a bit stuck. I think.
Sie erfordern internationale Zusammenarbeit. Sie erfordern Zusammenarbeit.
I think we stop that for the moment and we come back to Mrs. Karliczek. She's not running away. So I would say maybe from a different computer or a different version of the video, because it was running well when we tested it. In any case, so we want to discuss the role and instruments that governments use in science diplomacy. And of course, Mrs. Karliczek will also refer to some of the issues that are being done in the German government and some examples, but I have here now my 4 panelists for the day who are also working as science diplomats or in the interface between science and diplomacy within governments. Plus maybe some of them also a bit within academia. So we will see when they introduce themselves. We have to welcome Carole Mundel. She is the Chief International Science Envoy at the Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office in the UK and also at the University of Bath. We have Dan Dutoit. He is working in South Africa, where he is the Deputy Director General of the International in the International Corporations and Resources Department of the South African Department for Science and Innovation. Dirk-Jan Koch joins us from the Netherlands, where he is at the Ministry for Foreign Affairs, the Chief Science Officer. And last but not least, we have Ambassador Stefan Estermann, who is from Switzerland, the head of the Division Prosperity and Sustainability at the Federal Department for Foreign Affairs, Switzerland. I would like to invite, if you're already triggered by the panelists' positions, to use the chat and the QA function. And also we do have a poll question to involve the audience. So I would like to ask you in how far you agree with the following statement. Is your home country, wherever you're joining from, having a strategic approach to science diplomacy? So you can from strongly agree to disagree, neither agree or disagree. I'm seeing already some responses coming in. So thanks a lot. That's looking quite... I see, at least on my screen, rather the disagrees because they are up front, but I do think that the 33% of people who agree are also quite significant, and together with the ones that strongly agree make kind of like a very good set of people that are actually quite positive, but we also have 36% disagreeing, 36% agreeing now that Laurent, thank you for finishing the results. And I have to say that we asked this question, the same question, also in a survey that we were running between January and February this year, where we were disseminating throughout our social media and to our partners and our emails, the community, what they were thinking, and it was 189 answers that we received. And also here we saw that our community is quite equally distributed in the EU member states, but also outside. So it's almost 50-50 that answered our questionnaire. And the people that were answering from within the European Union were slightly more positive actually about the issue of having a strategic approach. So about 1/3 agreed or strongly agreed. And now let's see what our panelists say about their country. And about, we also have a geographical distribution of actually more people from outside the European Union than just one representative here from within the European Union. But we invited all of them because we believe that they have an insight into how to strategically approach science diplomacy. And in that sense, my general question that I was just asking them on behalf of all of you, and don't forget to put your individual questions in the Q&A, what works? So that's kind of like, how can you give us some insights, in your opinion, a general answer, to highlight some main points in relation to specific instruments or geographical thematic approach that are taken in your countries. And I think we wanted to start with Carole Mundel, so I would invite you for a first outline.
Okay, thank you. It's a great pleasure to be with you today. And I think this is a subject that's very close to my heart. So I spend 3 days of my week in government as a science diplomat and as a policy advisor and as a chief scientist. And I spend 2 days a week back in academia. And so I have quite a broad view of our science ecosystem. And I say science in the broadest sense in terms of our research and innovation across academia, industry, and out into society. I am an astrophysicist by background, and so without realizing, I've always been an international science diplomat. I collaborate internationally, and many of the facilities and the technologies that I exploit and I help to develop have to be done in an international multilateral way. They're too large for one single nation to develop alone. And this itself drives very strong people-to-people relationships and also drives up the quality of the science and technology and innovation that we develop to answer some of the most fundamental questions in the universe. Within government, my role, and when I first joined the Foreign Office, I joined as the Chief Scientific Advisor, and I've recently just taken up the post of a brand new post of International Science Envoy. And this really signals the importance that the UK government puts on international collaborations and people-to-people relationships. I think of science diplomacy in 3 ways, which your audience may be very familiar with. This was actually first coined, I think, at a meeting at the Royal Society over a decade ago now. So there's 3 parts to this. There's science in diplomacy, there's science for diplomacy, and there's diplomacy for scientists in the broadest sense. So science in diplomacy for me is a very broad approach to providing the best possible science evidence for policymakers. And so that is bringing in the best of the science that you have from your science ecosystem. Of course, if you have, as we do in the UK, very fortunately, we have a world-leading science base, world-leading universities, world-leading researchers. That also stretches broadly into the education side as well. And of course, we're able to bring that scientific evidence to the heart of policymaking, be that for strategic use or be that in emergencies, as we've done very strongly through through our mechanisms such as the Science Advisory Group in Emergencies for the COVID crisis. That's a mechanism that's been there for some time in government, and the government chief scientific advisor is able to draw on the right expertise for a complex emergency from across the whole of the science base. We have a network of chief scientific advisors across Whitehall, and so we provide a strong interface between the science ecosystem and government. Many of us are on secondment from academia or industry. And so bringing the best scientific evidence to the table for our policymakers means that they can produce the best policies that are evidence-based. They can advise our ministers so that the best decisions are made. And of course, from the Foreign Ministry's perspective, that's in the international context. So often we might be advising other governments, we might be working with partners around the world to solve real problems. And that might be immediate emergencies, or it might be larger global strategic problems like global climate change. And we can bring that back into our multilateral environments. The science for diplomacy is something that's slightly more subtle. That actually uses the people-to-people relationships that we build up, be that through governments, be that through universities or individual researchers on the ground. And that's particularly helpful when we have a very difficult relationship at the political or the diplomatic level. And often it's our scientists who are continuing to tackle questions that interest them, who don't see those national boundaries. And that's a very, very powerful way of keeping countries talking to one another and keeping those friendships open. And again, that's something that I work very much both with my academic hat on and also my diplomatic hat on. And then finally, there's how we provide that diplomacy back for scientists. And so we have an international network in the UK called the Science and Innovation Network. These are over 100 science and innovation attaches embedded in our embassies. And we cover over 50 countries and wider regions. This helps us to build the stakeholder relationships between the UK and other countries, both bilaterally and multilaterally. And those SIN officers, not only are they building those relationships in country, they also understand how the science system in those countries work. And so that's really valuable for helping our scientists back in the UK to navigate those new countries and build new partnerships and find new collaborations. And again, that's just part of that whole mechanism of building those collaborations and helping people find one another internationally so that we can tackle these global challenges such as climate change and global health together in a way that is not impinged by national borders. So I'll stop there and hand over. Thank you.
So I needed to unmute myself, sorry. But also if Dan or another panelist wants to just jump in right away, you're more than welcome. Dan Dutoit, I hope you could also unmute yourself. I don't. Yeah. No, we cannot hear you. I see you talking, and I know that we heard, yes.
Yes, it is amazing that after many months of us all spending our lives on these type of platforms, these type of challenges continue to arise. Well, first of all, let me say that even if our geographic and economic context even would differ from that of the United Kingdom, I can fully align myself with what Carol has just said. So Elke, I was tempted to answer the question in the poll, but then I realized the panelists are not allowed to respond. Because I was tempted to say, yes, South Africa has a robust, I strongly agree, we have a robust science diplomacy strategy, but of course, I hopefully there are other South Africans in the audience, and they may well disagree, because of course I'm perhaps biased, because my role within the South African government is really to lead that science diplomacy strategy. I mean, just first of all, why science diplomacy is so important for South Africa. We like to believe that our democracy is, I mean, one of our tenets is that we're a country which is open to the world, and we're committed to global solidarity and multilateralism. And similarly, one of our policy fundamentals is that investment in science and innovation is essential for the advancement of sustainable development and improving the quality of living of our citizens. So that coming together of international cooperation in science really speaks in many instances for what us as government is all about. So if we then agree, well, if I agree with myself that yes, we do have a robust science diplomacy strategy and it works for South Africa, perhaps what are some of, building on what Carol said, what are some of the things which have worked for us? I mean, first of all, you have to make resources available. You need to have a strategy, and then you need to have to put in place structures, and different countries can do it differently. For example, in South Africa, we have within our science ministry, and that's where I work, we call ourselves the Department of Science and Innovation. We have a dedicated team of close to 70 people just focused on international cooperation. So that was a deliberate policy choice, as opposite some countries would locate some of those functions in the foreign affairs or the foreign ministries. We've decided to locate that in the science ministry, but then maintain very, very close collaboration with our colleagues in other sister departments and ministries. But I think it's not only about putting in place those structures and programs, it's really also about investment in people and personal relationships. So we, for example, spend a lot of time with our diplomats, and all South African diplomats being posted abroad spend some time in a training course run by our department, giving them an overview of the state of science in South Africa, not only what are our priorities for international cooperation, but which are also the resources which exist within the South African science system, which could serve to inform policy and decision-making with regard to foreign relations. And I think then just the last point, when it comes to promoting international cooperation in science, perhaps looking really through a developing country perspective, I'm sure the United Kingdom would not necessarily have that challenge. We really have to work hard at marketing ourselves as a science nation. For South Africa, it's very important, and therefore we invest a lot, just as we are often marketed as a destination for tourism, and we hope that when international travel returns, you will all come and visit us. But we don't only want to be a country known for safaris of the Big Five or Table Mountain, but also as a partner for science and innovation. And now I was delighted to hear that Carol is an astrophysicist, because our flagship science project is the host of the Global Square Kilometre Array Radio Telescope. And that has meant a lot in the way our international partners have changed their perspective on collaboration, not only with South Africa, but with the rest of Africa. That we're not only a partner for collaboration in, say, food security and infectious disease, but indeed also for frontier science. So just a few snippets there to inform the discussion. Thanks, Elke.
Thanks a lot. And indeed, the SKA was also mentioned at the opening ceremony that we had yesterday by the Deputy General Signe Razzo from DG Research and Innovation. So you succeeded to penetrate the discussion here very well, I think. The SKA is a very good example. Dirk-Jan, would you like to complement now maybe the member state intervention here? You're the only one representing an EU member state.
Oh, okay, wow. And I also tried to vote, and I think I would have voted that I'm not so convinced by our own strategy for science diplomacy, to be honest. Maybe I'll explain I'll explain that it doesn't mean that we're not effective, but I don't think we have an overarching strategy yet. But we will be working on that. So actually, I wanted to make it a bit more specific and concrete, Elke, if you allow me, for the participants. So in the Netherlands, we're trying to really focus on the science for diplomacy aspects, because what we find is that scientists, wherever you see them across the globe, they tend to speak the same language. I mean, even though they speak different languages, they speak the same language, So one of the countries where we have had not easy relationship with, bilaterally speaking, is Indonesia, of course, our former colony, and quite some diplomatic discussions not going that smoothly, but our Prime Minister visited there, and he said, at least in the level of science collaboration, we can look forward towards the future, and both Prime Ministers agreed. And what they've agreed on is that they would have a conference, have an extensive bilateral collaboration between Indonesia and the Netherlands in the field of science. I will just rapidly try to share my screen so I can show you a bit what we've been doing. No, I don't think it wants me to share my screen, unfortunately. It's okay. So what we have organized is an intensive bilateral collaboration with Indonesia in the field of science. And we thought that with COVID, it would be more difficult, but we've seen actually that it's much easier to organize broad-based science consultations with COVID. I mean, we could work with many more universities. You know, Indonesia is a big country. Normally it's only focused on the capital, but now we could include all different regions. We could have many more sessions. We have had, yeah, we were actually quite positive. And we see that the science collaboration really is a positive venue also to collaborate, but also to display your own values. You know, there are some issues which are very important for the Netherlands, like the transparency and openness. And we thought that by organizing so many shared research projects, yeah, those values you can really bring to the fore. And the nice thing, of course, is that we have so many shared challenges from biodiversity. It's a huge issue in both Indonesia. They have a lot, to be honest, but it's diminishing. In the Netherlands, we have very little, but we want to increase it. You know, so there's a lot of joint issues of interest. So, yeah, I think that even though we don't have maybe an overarching strategy, there is really, with concrete activities, you can make a difference.
Thanks, Dirk-Jan. In the preparatory talk, I also mentioned that you are one of the few countries that have this science diplomacy program specifically. How did that come apart? Because I think this was a bit special when you launched it. And if you can say just a few words, I would be really curious.
Yeah, and there we go. I did manage to share my screen, I think, now. So we did start at the ministry the Science Diplomacy Fund together with our Dutch Research Council. You see the abbreviation in the top, NWO. We have launched this collaboration facility, especially for countries with which we have sometimes challenging relationships. So for the first round, we selected Russia, Turkey, and Indonesia. So researchers from both countries can propose collaborative projects in which they will work together, stimulate exchange, and of course, and we see it's already bearing fruit. We see that we are intensifying collaboration because of this program with those countries. But at the same time, and I can be honest, you know, it is tricky because if you want to do it, for instance, with there's other countries with which we have more difficult relationships. Think about Iran, for instance, or Venezuela. Then our parliament says no, this, and our minister subsequently say no, this is too tricky. Let's not go that way. So yes, I believe personally wholeheartedly in the science for diplomacy, but there's also some limits because some countries are just considered to be too tricky by ministers and parliamentarians. But for this other category, the Indonesia, Russia, Turkey, it really helps us to create channels of communication.
I found that distinction very interesting, and I would now hand over to Ambassador Esterman, because Switzerland has a little less of the colonial past to overcome, and but certainly as well some priorities for collaboration. What works for Switzerland?
Thank you very much. Yes, what works? We are a small but very innovative country, and I think science has become really of growing importance in our foreign policy. We do have a brand new foreign policy strategy that has been worked out by all our ministries in a joint effort. And I just checked, the word science appears 28 times. So it is definitely there. Science becomes more and more part of our foreign policy. So what works? As my UK colleague already said, different approaches to science diplomacy. There is, I would say, the traditional approach, which we call diplomacy for science, which is more under the umbrella of the responsible ministry in our case, but we, from the foreign policy point of view, we also play a great role. We have 23 science advisors that are integrated in embassies abroad. We have what we call the Swiss Next hubs, actually encouraging innovation and science cooperation in 5 different global innovation hubs in Shanghai, Bangalore, Rio de Janeiro, and in Boston and in San Francisco. Maybe something that is more interesting or what works, just to give you a good example for diplomacy for science. We in Switzerland, we have a huge community doing high altitude research, climate research, ice cone research. So this kind of stuff, you can imagine we have the cryosphere, the high mountains in Switzerland, and all this research community, of course, does also do research in the Arctic and in the poles. And in order to create a linkage between our science community doing research in the ice and on climate issues with Arctic research, Switzerland has joined the Arctic Council as an observer country. And we did it specifically to give some backing, some political backing and legitimacy and visibility to our research community doing this great and very relevant climate research in the high altitude area. So for me, a good example what works in diplomacy for science. Now, science diplomacy, I think, is even more interesting. You know, there is the dogma, the classic dogma, of course, that science is being done for the sake of science. Science must be bottom up, and we very much do respect that. But our approach to science for diplomacy is wherever we see interesting science projects happening that could have a diplomatic benefit, that we could, sort of instrumentalize, to use that word, that we could instrumentalize or even worse, abuse for diplomatic purposes, we do not hesitate to do that. I can give you a very nice example. There has been an initiative which is called Middle East Biology of Parasitism. So these are young researchers in the field of parasitism from Iran, from Israel, from North Africa, from Sub-Saharan Africa. 60 of them came to Switzerland for a summer course. And the initiative was initiated by a researcher from Israel and by a researcher from Palestinian origin. And I had the honor to be present at the graduation ceremony of these 60 young people, specialists in their field from these different regions. And that was a fantastic experience. And you can imagine that by organizing such an event, you bring people together, you create the spirit of cooperation, and you realize that they finally are all the same. So that was for me a very good example where we could use scientific cooperation that is already taking place for actually fostering dialogue, because science is neutral, science is apolitical, and science is by definition international, because country borders don't play any role at all in science. But the more we can overcome borders, the more we can overcome dividing lines, the better and more meaningful science is. Now the third thing that really works and that is very relevant is what we call science in diplomacy. Here we have one focus on International Geneva. International Geneva is an incredible hub of 42 international organizations, 177 state representations, 750 NGOs, all being in this relatively small space. And what we try to do is really in this microcosm of Geneva, trying to foster the exchange, the dialogue between the diplomatic community that's there and the scientific community that's also there, trying to bring them together. We have created something that's called the Geneva Science and Diplomacy Anticipator, and that is actually thinking far ahead to identify scientific developments and challenges that could be relevant to diplomacy, and very much also linked to all the diplomatic challenges involved by digitalization. And we have recently appointed a special envoy for science diplomacy in Geneva. Geneva, by the way, is host city also of one structure that has been sort of at the origin of the very idea of science in diplomacy and also science for diplomacy. That is CERN, the European Organization for Nuclear Research, with its huge proton accelerator. That is, by the way, something that can also be replicated in the future, a model of scientific cooperation around one infrastructure that is benefiting for all the countries in an entire region. So there are so many avenues. Science in diplomacy, just to conclude by that, very important in climate diplomacy, of course, because it's all science-based. Very important when we try to reach the Agenda 2030 goals, because the measurement, how we reach these goals, it's all science-based. That is why we are hosting in September the UN World Data Summit in our capital in Bern. So there is a huge potential for us, and I'm really enthusiastic about this subject. Thank you very much.
Thanks for sharing your enthusiasm. There are, I think, some of the people in the audience also quite enthusiastic, and there have been some questions which I would like to draw in. There are questions, mainly, I think the first one ranked is for Dan Dutoit. This is about the kind of like making the science diplomacy strategy official. So is there something written? Is there something that you can refer our colleague Pierre-Bruno Ruffini, who has asked this question, to? So Dan, how about official strategies?
Yes, so our current high-level policy document on science, technology and innovation is called our white paper on science, technology and innovation, and that has a dedicated section devoted to science diplomacy. Currently, work is underway in developing the new decadal plan, that is a 10-year plan for science, technology and innovation in South Africa, which goes into very detailed actions, and that will also have a section on science diplomacy. So, but perhaps Elke, whilst I have the floor, perhaps just to add to the discussion and then perhaps to be a bit more provocative. So I share completely in the enthusiasm of everyone. And yes, we're going to save the world through science diplomacy. But of course, first of all, we have to be careful that it doesn't become a buzzword. And we had to temper some of that enthusiasm in South Africa to just always really interrogate what it is we mean with science diplomacy. And then secondly, there are aspects of the international interface, between international cooperation and science, which sometimes become much more complicated. It is good for scientists to work together, and we agree they speak the same language. But when we get closer to the marketplace, application of science, innovation, then competition rears its head, including between countries. So to be very frank with you, in the interest of good conversation, there are elements of our science diplomacy strategy which you will not find written down in a public document, because they are matters of national interest, of strategic national interest, both from an offensive and a defensive nature. There are countries, for example, who use science diplomacy as a vehicle for access to foreign markets. And then I think that is fine. That's the way the world works. But I think we should always remember that when we celebrate, indeed, whether it's against COVID-19, climate change, food security, science diplomacy is imperative, but there are also other dimensions as well.
Absolutely, and I think we discussed in our project a lot also about this implicit and explicit use of the term, and that sometimes it's better to not name, I think, science diplomacy. Also myself, I have found myself in the situation where I said, like, I'm just happy when I can call it International Science Cooperation. So indeed, there have been a set of questions. I don't know, Dirk-Jan, if you had a look at the Q&A section. I think you can just take all of them together and talk a little bit more about the Science Diplomacy Fund. And if for the audience, I don't know if for the audience I need to repeat the questions, but maybe Dirk-Jan, you can refer. It's about to measure the results and what type of activities are funded. Just a little bit more details on that.
Excellent. Yes, Elke, thank you. So thank you. The question by Marga on how to measure the results of science diplomacy efforts, I think it's to everybody. It's a very tough one because we're struggling with that. It's easy to measure the outputs, you know, the number of research partnerships that exist or the number of joint publications, but in terms of how to measure diplomatic effects, it's a bit more difficult. Then we have a good question by Pauline Ravinet, and she's focusing on SDF and what type of activities are funded with the Science Diplomacy Fund. And this is really for the early stage development, so think about joint program development activities, joint conferences, joint seminars, visits, mutual exchange visits. And then the idea is that they graduate from the Science Diplomacy Fund to our regular scientific collaboration instruments. We have large funds in which we are often together with governments of partner countries. So this is like the seed funding, the inception funding. And we collaborate with the Ministry, of course, of Education and Sciences, especially on which countries are eligible. This is really a joint decision. Does the Dutch fund, that's a question by Helene Betuche, I think. Yes, it goes indirectly to those scientists from other countries, right? But it's the idea that it's a partnership. So you submit it together with the Dutch university. Then I get a lot of difficult questions, but I'm thankful for them at the same time. By Max Ezekiel, he's asking whether I think that the EU as a whole does have a proper science and diplomacy framework or strategy. And I think that's the last question that I will answer in this batch. I think that it's starting to emerge, to be honest. So we're celebrating this year the 10th anniversary of the EU External Action Service, EEAS. And we see that now for the first time the EU also starts to have science and technology advisors. So located within the EEAS, so it's starting, but it's not yet a proper diplomatic strategy, full-blown. So I think that's a work in progress. So I'll leave it at that. Back to you, Elke.
Super, thanks. I think that was a good run through. I would like to give the floor to Carol. I think you have also spotted some questions in the Q&A and some reactions that you wanted to give.
Thanks, Elke. Yeah, I'd like to draw some of these really interesting points together. And I think, talking particularly around how we use science diplomacy and how we deploy it. And I think one caution really is around the politicization of science diplomacy, so building on Dan's comment. And particularly, we have a real challenge around disinformation, particularly in the online digital space. So I think it's incumbent on us all not to overuse science diplomacy and to do science diplomacy for the sake of science diplomacy. And I would ask everybody to go back to the authenticity of the science. So what is the integrity of your science system? How are governments funding the research? We've heard about bottom up, but I mean, for me, there's mission driven and then there's bottom up. And there's a tension between those two systems. There's a tension between the funding and the funding structures and mechanisms that you have in your country. Government, of course, can deploy funding for strategic use. So we may do this in terms of opening up programs, bilateral science programs between two countries. That may be to address a particular science issue or a wider mission-driven issue around something like climate change or global health. But of course, from that, we then derive diplomatic benefit. So I think it's always good to think about what are the objectives, what are the mechanisms, and then how do you go back to the integrity of this? And one of the things I think that we find very important in the UK is that culture of open international collaboration, peer review and the quality of the science that is being done. And of course, that's not something that we can take for granted or just leave to happen naturally. We have to work to make sure that our funding systems are robust, that we have the highest quality peer review there, that our journals who are publishing the research are also full of integrity. The Royal Society of Chemistry published a report last year that showed a high degree of gender bias in scientific publishing. And so we also have to look at our own systems and our own biases and tackle those operationally before we start to talk about how we work with other countries on a value-based way, and particularly in the open rule-based international system. And that also goes to the heart of public trust in each of our countries. And I think when you have authenticity in all of that, and the public engagement that you do within your own country, science diplomacy is then very, very powerful, because the people-to-people relationships are then built on that integrity. I think if you don't have that, or you forget to keep an eye on that and make sure that that's all or well funded or well resourced or well scrutinized, then I think you start to do science diplomacy in a way that's less powerful and starts to breach trust. And I think if the whole world moves towards that contested space of science diplomacy for science diplomacy's sake, then we stop doing it, and actually it's not very valuable. And I think also for our diplomats, science is one tool that they can deploy, but what we're also very keen to help our policy teams and our diplomats understand is the scientific method. So the ability to challenge our assumptions, the assumptions that we bring into the policy space, and what kind of evidence do we use, and how do we know that that's the right evidence, that we've reached out to the right experts and we've brought the right kinds of people and a diverse set of people and voices into the room to actually interrogate our policy processes. So I think all of those coming together, and the community that you have watching today, I think we'll have all of those pieces in their minds, but it's always good for us always to go back and recheck where we are in that landscape, along particularly that prosperity security axis for each of our countries, and are we being actually really honest in our systems? Thank you.
Great, thank you, Carol. We have a few questions again from the audience that I would just bring forward to you. One is about this interministerial coordination in a way, and so is there a risk that if we have these kind of projects, scientific projects with diplomatic benefit that Ambassador Esterman was mentioning, is there a risk that at a certain point none of the ministries would feel responsible for them? Is there too much, is there then budget coming from both ministries to these kind of projects, or how do you see a danger in that? That was a question from Joran Beldengrun. To, I think, Stefan, yes, Mr. Esterman, if you would take that one.
Thank you very much. Okay. Yes, indeed, interministerial cooperation or interagency cooperation is a big issue. And I'm in the lucky position that my division has been specifically created to improve interministerial cooperation and to bring in all the sectoral expertise from the specialized agency right into the foreign ministry. So what we do is we are building bridges to all the specialized government agencies and ministries. We have part of the expertise in-house to be able to be knowledgeable interlocutors for our colleagues in the other ministries. And we create these bridges. There is, of course, competition. That's always the case. People are naturally safeguarding their piece of the cake and their garden, but we are working on it to overcome this. And especially in the area of science diplomacy, of course, we have agreements, we have de facto divisions of labor, so they let us do our things, but we always inform each other. I think that is really key, to inform your partner in the specialized agency, in the other ministry, and not do things behind their backs or circumventing them, but always informing them, always consulting them, have them on board. Budgetary issues are less an issue because all our projects, practically all our projects, are funded not by the Swiss Confederation, but they are funded by the scientific stakeholders, by the universities, by private foundations. So this is for us the essence. If we speak about bottom-up approach in science, bottom-up means also the finance has to come bottom-up. So finance are less an issue in this equilibrium that we have to find. Thanks.
Thank you. I don't know if any one of the other panelists wants to raise their hand and immediately react on that. Dan, yes.
Elke?
You may, of course.
Yeah, I mean, this is a very topical discussion for us, the question of budgets for international cooperation, especially in a current climate where, because of the economic impact of COVID-19, public finances in South Africa are really constrained. So I really appreciated Carol's points and yours. So let's put aside the buzzword effect of science diplomacy. So for South Africa to invest in international cooperation in science, our primary criterion will always remain excellence and the impact of the science. And whether that partnership is worth investing to enable a sharing of experience, of resources, of co-investment to achieve the scientific objective. That we will not compromise on. And that is where the main part of our budget is coming from. It's coming from our health sciences research program, our environmental sciences, our physical sciences program. And my colleagues who are heading those programs will chase me away if I come with a program with country X, if there's no scientific merit or compelling scientific merit to pursue that. That said, we know there are sometimes programs and partnerships we need to invest in primarily for the science for diplomacy perspective. And for that, we remain a dedicated, smaller budget, which we safeguard because we believe that's important, not only in support of our government's foreign policy objective, but it is also part of seed funding, which makes sure that we continue to maintain a broad and a diverse portfolio of relations. But I think it's a very pertinent question to consider the budgetary implications, especially in the current time for all governments.
Yeah, thanks a lot. And then as a next round, I see here also two very interesting comments that go on a more geographical level as well, kind of like the power dynamics between global north, global south, and another question on the expansion of China that has an influence in science as well as diplomacy. So who would feel comfortable? I see Carol and Dirk-Jan. So Carol, you go first. And
thank you, Alka. Yeah, really important questions. To tackle the China question first, I would say that we are working very closely with China on the global challenges, particularly climate change. It's clear that we can't have China not involved in that conversation. We see countries who are being impacted already very disproportionately with the impacts of climate change. Those countries are likely to be the ones that are least contributing to the global carbon budget. And that also then feeds into the question about the global north and the global south. This is work that we're working on very hard at the moment in the UK to host the International COP26 conference. And of course, we're pushing member states around the world to come forward with really ambitious targets. So both in terms of the ambition and also the development of the technology to tackle climate change. China has to be a major player there. And of course, to fail to engage with them would be a failure for the planet. So I think that's something that we all need to keep at the heart of the science that we do. That said, every nation enters into a relationship with another country in a clear-eyed way. And I think that's for each country to look at their own priorities in terms of that, and also their past history. Many countries on this call will have past colonial histories, and we'll be thinking about our relationships, both in terms of the global north and south. What I've observed through the COVID crisis has been very much a sharing of expertise. So it's not even necessary that it's a sharing of money. It's actually helping other countries build capacity. And the good example here that I've been involved with directly, of course, has been the genomic sequencing. So the UK has, I think, the world's largest public genomic sequence database, which we've made publicly open to the world. So scientists from around the world can tap into that database, and we've been building the infrastructure to make sure that that's easy to use. And also understanding the value of the data. So, just taking a genomic sequence is not valuable unless you have the metadata, unless you're able to analyze those data in all sorts of different ways. That feeds then into a wider piece of work on ethics and standards, and again, helping the world to define those ethics and standards. That becomes a question about whether you're an open liberal democracy, whether you're an autocratic regime, and that goes to wider geopolitical conversations about norms of behavior around the world, whether that's deep ocean seabed, whether that's outer space. It's all of these multilateral spaces that we're having these conversations. So I think it's nuanced, and I think we have to attack it with some intelligence. But what we've seen from the global pandemic is that no one's safe until we're all safe. And I think that for me has been some of the most powerful science diplomacy when I've facilitated conversations between world leading scientists. I think it was Durkheim who said, all scientists speak the same language. Actually, would be beyond disciplines, they don't speak the same language. They have to find ways to speak to one another in an interdisciplinary science space as well. And so bringing those experts together and seeing them connect and have these very technical conversations and then widening that out, has been really powerful for me to help to support that. that. And I think building that capacity in other countries, merely sometimes by asking questions. So we asked many of our partners around the world about their genomic sequencing capability, particularly at the animal-human interface. And that actually triggered ministries within those countries to start to say, actually, what are our systems? We need to go away and look, because we can't answer these questions. And this is particularly for variants of concern around COVID. We work very closely with our Danish counterparts around the mink COVID outbreak there. And then we started to ask other countries around the world, because of course the Danes had a very strong system, a very transparent science system, which was a real privilege to work with. So I think we can drive better behaviours in other countries. We're not coming in to tell that country what to do. We're actually sharing and collaborating with our knowledge and with some humility about what we do well, what we've learned, and how we share that knowledge. So I think that's a very powerful way to do deep science diplomacy, actually.
Highly appreciated. Dirk-Jan, you follow up?
Yes, thanks. And indeed, thank you for a very interesting question by Chitarika on this power relations. And indeed, I think we should not ignore that. For instance, I'm also a scientist, and when I publish, I can always publish open access because my university has some kind of nice deal with the big publishing houses, or the Dutch universities have that, but the same African scholar cannot publish open access, so he'll have less chance to be cited and to be seen. So I think it's a real issue. What we try to do in our science collaboration is to really make sure that we do it on in an equal way, Carol just said, you have to see, you have to work with some humility. We always try to make sure there's equal participation. For instance, in the case of Indonesia, there's equal participation of Dutch and Indonesian scientists, of Dutch and Indonesian ministers. You really try to make sure that that you don't behave like, oh, I'm from the global north, and start to behave in a condescending way. I don't have the feeling, that's the question by Francesca, if the Science for Diplomacy Fund that we have in the Netherlands, from which this winner conference was also the result that it's politicized. I think it's quite science driven actually, and that you cannot force scientists to collaborate. They will choose to collaborate, or they will not collaborate if they don't find that it's academically interesting enough. Then the last question on China, it's a tough one. We have adapted our China policy. We were really always more in the field of supporting it and maximizing exchange. We've become a bit more cautious in trying to protect our key technologies and making sure that there's any intellectual property right theft. So we really had various sessions with our universities to make sure that they have the right checks in place to make sure that this doesn't leak if you don't want it to leak. Over to you, Elke.
Yeah, thank you. I would take short 1-minute comments if you want to complement something on the discussion or on something you read in the Q&A, and also invite our graphic recording colleague Javier to get ready to show us a little bit what he captured from today's session. So maybe we can share the graphic recording, and I give each of you the floor for some kind of takeaway key messages or something you would like to complement. And if I may, I just go through the order that we had established at the beginning. Carol, would you like to go first?
Thank you. I think this is a fantastic graphic representation of a very rich discussion. So congratulations there. And it's nice to see scientists sitting at the heart of that diagram. I think for me, a personal reflection this past year, I have worked almost exclusively from home for 12 months. Technology has been a wonderful enabler, despite the very tragic global crisis that we've been facing with this pandemic. The pandemic for me has shone a light of inequality on inequality in all our societies, and so I don't think that we can be complacent. We have much to learn, and we have much to learn to tackle future pandemics and also the deep causes of those pandemics, which go to very systematic issues around biodiversity, our relationships with nature, and how we treat our planet. But the one thing that has really inspired me throughout all of this has been the incredible dedication and resilience of our scientists. And they have reorientated their science, their universities have refocused their efforts to really tackle this pandemic. And what it's shown us is what's possible when we come together and we work on a global challenge. 12 months ago, when we were, tackling this new virus that was emerging from Wuhan that we knew little about, we were immensely grateful to the Chinese authorities for having made the entire genome sequence available early on to the rest of the world so that our scientists could tackle the tests, the development of vaccines. And we could not imagine that we would have one vaccine 12 months later, let alone a whole suite of them. And I've been absolutely, blown away by the innovation that's been required in the engineering in the vaccine companies. Just merely the engineering to design a paddle to mix up vaccine mixture at scale is already an innovation. So we see innovation throughout all of our systems. I hope that we can support our politicians to work well in this space. I think from the UK's perspective, we've been very strong in our messaging that we need equitable access to those vaccines and that the world needs to come together to deliver that. We pushed very hard for funding to be put into the COVAX facility so that all nations that do not have the access to vaccines that some of us do will actually have fair and equitable access to those vaccines, and we will continue to push on that and hope that partners will join us to use that mechanism as a fair and equitable way to distribute the vaccines that have come from the wonderful scientific collaborations that we've seen come together. And of course, science is competitive in its nature. We've given a very positive impression of scientists collaborating together, and as a scientist, I think Dirk-Jan, you mentioned this as well, that we also compete for funding, and so scientifically we will make our collaborations and we will compete with one another, and that will drive up the standards. But overall, the world for me has become a small and friendlier and more connected place because of some of the challenges that we've tackled this year. So I hope that that can continue, and it's been a great pleasure to connect with you all today, and I hope we can stay in touch. Thank you.
Thanks, Carol.
Thanks, Elke. Just a brief comment on the global power dynamics, which of course is a reality. But if anything, what South Africa's experience, and specifically during COVID-19, has shown that it is possible to maintain a broad and diverse portfolio of international relations. We have excellent relations with the United Kingdom under the Newton Fund. We are preparing for active participation in Horizon Europe. And we are a proud member of the Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, BRICS Science and Technology Innovation Framework Program. So indeed, those realities are there, but ultimately, and now I'm again having the danger of falling into the buzzwords and into the slogan, as COVID-19 has shown, we need each other, we need to work together. And something we are very proud of, right at the onset of COVID-19, we had a video conference of all of our international partners. We invited everyone and we shared experience. And during that discussion, the representative of the Chinese Ministry of Science and Technology challenged other nations whether they would not be interested in trilateral cooperation between China, specifically Europe and Africa. And we are very proud that next month we'll be releasing the results of the trilateral China, South Africa, Belgian research program. So it is possible. Yes, we have sometimes competing interests, but ultimately the overdriving motives and drivers for science and international cooperation in science remains compelling. And just the last word, my congratulations to everyone involved in this very exciting project. I think you've really added significant value to our understanding as well as strategic perspective on this concept of science diplomacy. And it's certainly something I'm quite jealous of because it's the type of project and programs we would like to have in Africa. Thank you very much.
Thank you. We can work on that. Dirk-Jan, we should leave some time for the German minister as well. So I'm a bit trying to. Your floor is yours. Right away.
I don't have anything to add. Great to be here. I'll just add one interesting link for you all in the chat of the Hague Journal for Diplomacy, which is a kind of focuses really on this science in diplomacy, how you can be more evidence-based in your diplomacy. Over to you.
Over to Stefan.
Thank you very much. I was not able to actually read the graphic because my smartphone is too small for that. But yes, I want to underline that geopolitical questions are always at the backdrop of what we do. That is why we try to do it. If you want to do, for example, research on these unique corals in the Red Sea, and you want to send a research boat there, it's immediately becoming, of course, a highly political and diplomatic challenge. There was one question addressed to me about what we are doing in the Arctic Council. Of course, it's to give back into our researchers doing this very much needed research up there. But of course, everybody knows that there is also a geopolitical issue behind it that becomes more and more important with the ice melting, with the Arctic becoming more accessible. Of course, also China is there considering itself as a near Arctic country, and so on and so forth. But my lesson really is all those obstacles that are, sometimes in the way of researchers. Very often they come from bureaucrats and diplomats. And sometimes I really do feel ashamed because they are ready to cooperate. They are ready to join forces and overcome borders. And very often they are limited by stupid geopolitical constraints and by military heads and others. So that's when I sometimes feel ashamed, and that's where I really see the strength of research diplomacy, of science diplomacy to overcome this. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Stefan. We're happy to have you there in Switzerland and all the other colleagues. And I am already have to say farewell. We are starting a new session in 5 minutes in another room. And for this room, I would give the last words now to Minister Karliczek from Germany to try again to have this video. And then we will close this session. And thank you very much again warmly to all the panelists and for everyone who asked questions and engaged in the chat. So now let's share the final words. Thank you.
Sehr geehrte Damen und Herren, Corona, Klimawandel, Biodiversität. Die Herausforderungen unserer Zeit sind internationale Herausforderungen und wir können sie nur gemeinsam meistern. Sie erfordern internationale Zusammenarbeit. Sie erfordern eine Zusammenarbeit gerade in Bildung, Wissenschaft und Forschung. Mein Ministerium setzt sich deshalb dafür ein, die Wissenschaftsdiplomatie zu stärken. Wissenschaftsdiplomatie baut Brücken. Sie trägt zum gegenseitigen Verständnis bei. Und unsere Aktivitäten haben wir gebündelt und strategisch ausgerichtet. Sie haben 3 Ziele. Erstens, wir wollen mit Bildung und Wissenschaft Menschen weltweit zusammenbringen. Wir wollen dauerhafte Partnerschaften schaffen mit einem Land oder einer Region. Zweitens, wir widmen uns der wissensbasierten Beratung von Politik und Gesellschaft. Wir brauchen verlässliche Daten und Forschungsergebnisse, um gute politische Entscheidungen treffen zu können. Die Covid-19-Pandemie hat das doch mehr als deutlich gemacht. Und drittens, wir setzen uns aktiv für die Freiheit von Wissenschaft, Forschung und Lehre ein. In vielen Ländern der Welt sind sie alles andere als selbstverständlich. Wir fördern den Aufbau von internationalen Forschungsinfrastrukturen und unterstützen die Mobilität von Auszubildenden, Studierenden und auch Forschern. Auf unserem Weg haben wir schon eine Menge erreicht. Wir unterhalten mit 47 Ländern weltweit Abkommen der wissenschaftlich-technologischen Zusammenarbeit. Allein in den vergangenen 5 Jahren haben wir hier im Haus mehr als 2600 Projekte in der Wissenschaftsdiplomatie finanziert. Heute sind weltweit mehr als 50 deutsche Wissenschaftsdiplomaten an deutschen Botschaften im Einsatz, um die wissenschaftliche Zusammenarbeit zu unterstützen. Und ein Aspekt ist mir dabei besonders wichtig. Die Europäische Union wird getragen von gemeinsamen Werten. Die Freiheit der Wissenschaft ist ein existenzieller Bestandteil dieses Wertefundaments. Die Freiheit der Forschung sollte aus meiner Sicht stets eine sichtbare Grundlage eines jeden Dialogs über Forschung und Innovation sowie einer jeden Forschungszusammenarbeit sein. Ich habe deshalb im Rahmen der deutschen EU-Ratspräsidentschaft die Bonner Erklärung zur Forschungsfreiheit ins Leben gerufen. Wir haben es als Wissenschaftsminister der Europäischen Union geschafft, ein starkes Signal für die Freiheit der Forschung in die Welt zu senden. Die Bonner Erklärung hat Strahlkraft, nach innen wie nach außen. Wir stehen in der Europäischen Union für die Forschungsfreiheit ein, gerade in Zeiten, in denen weltweit und ja, leider auch in Europa immer häufiger von Verletzungen dieser Freiheit berichtet wird. Der Wissenschaftsdiplomatie kommt genau an dieser Stelle eine ganz entscheidende Rolle zu. Wir brauchen eine Politik, die auf wissenschaftlichen Fakten basiert. Wir brauchen den freien Dialog von Wissenschaft und Forschung. Und in diesem Sinne wünsche ich Ihnen eine fruchtbare Diskussion in dieser Konferenz.
Thank you so much and see you in the next sessions, hopefully. Goodbye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.